Princess Varathi was born without a voice, and in the Draconid Imperium, that meant she was born without a soul. Her kind had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years, and their power came from fire that burned in their throats since birth, and every dragon could breathe flames that carried their true name, and this name was not something their parents chose for them, but something that existed in their very blood and bones and spirit. When a dragon spoke with fire, the whole universe could hear them, and when they roared their true name, the stars themselves seemed to tremble, and this was the source of all Draconid power and pride and glory. But Varathi could only produce smoke. The healers had examined her since she was a hatchling, and they had pressed their claws against her throat and looked into her flame glands with instruments made of crystal and light. And they had shaken their massive heads and told the emperor that his youngest daughter was defective Emperor Kalvaxer. Had 17 children, and all of them burned bright except for Varathi, and he did not know what to do with her, and he could not kill her because she was still of royal blood, but he could not present her to the court because she would bring shame upon his name. So he hid her away. Varathi grew up in the lower spires of the imperial palace where the servants lived and worked, and she had chambers that were comfortable, but far from the golden halls where her siblings walked and laughed and breathed fire at each other in greeting. She watched her brothers and sisters through windows and screens, and she saw them command fleets and conquer worlds and speak at ceremonies where thousands of dragons roared their names together in a chorus of flame that lit up the night sky. And Varathi sat alone in her room and tried again and again to breathe fire, and each time only gray smoke came from her throat, and each time she felt the emptiness inside her grow larger. The court called her the Silent One behind her back, and some of the crueler nobles called her the Ash Princess, because ash was all that remained when fire died, and they believed she had been born with a dead flame. Varathi heard these whispers, and they cut deeper than any claw could cut. By the time she reached her 30th cycle, she had stopped trying to breathe fire, and she had stopped hoping that one day her flame would ignite, and she had accepted that she would live and die in the shadows of her family, never knowing what it felt like to speak her own name. Then the humans arrived. The Draconid Imperium had discovered Earth 50 cycles ago, and they had watched the small blue planet with mild curiosity and the creatures that lived there were soft and weak and had no fire at all, and the Imperial Council had debated whether they were even worth conquering. But humans had something valuable, and that something was their hands. Dragon claws were powerful and could tear through metal and stone, but they were not made for delicate work, and the Imperium needed workers who could repair the tiny circuits in their ships and clean the sensitive optical arrays in their weapons and tend to wounds that required gentle touch. So they conquered Earth in 3 days. The humans fought back, of course, because that was what humans did, but their weapons were primitive, and their ships were slow, and they had no fire to match the Draconid flames, and in the end they knelt before the Emperor and accepted their place as servants of the Imperium. Thousands of humans were brought to the homeworld to work as slaves, and they were assigned to noble houses throughout the Empire, and one of them was sent to the lower spires to serve the princes that no one talked about. His name was Callum. He was not young anymore, and his hair had started to turn gray at the edges, and his hands were rough from years of work, but his eyes were sharp and curious, and he looked at everything around him like he was trying to memorize every detail. Before the conquest, he had been a professor at a university on Earth, and he had spent his whole life studying languages, both living and dead, and he had learned to read ancient scripts that no one had spoken in thousands of years, and he had written books about how words carried meaning across time and space. None of this mattered to the Draconid, and they saw him only as another pair of hands to scrub floors and carry trays and perform the small tasks that were beneath their notice. Callum did not complain, and he did not resist, and he simply watched and listened and learned. On his first day in the lower spires, he saw Princess Varathi standing on her balcony, and she was staring at the sky where ships moved like fireflies in the darkness, and he could see the longing on her face, even though her features were alien and covered in scales of deep purple and silver. And he saw the smoke curling from her throat. It was faint and gray, and it rose into the air and vanished. But Callum noticed something that made him stop and stare, and he noticed that the smoke had patterns, and the patterns seemed almost deliberate, like words written in mist. He had spent his life finding meaning in things that others overlooked, and he had reconstructed dead languages from fragments of pottery and scraps of leather, and he knew that communication could take forms that most people never recognized. So he began to watch the princess. Every day he performed his duties, and every night he found excuses to be near her chambers, and he observed the way her smoke changed when she was sad or angry or lost in thought, and he started to see patterns within patterns and meanings within meanings. The other servants thought he was strange, and the guards paid him no attention because he was just a human, and humans were beneath notice, and Verethi herself barely acknowledged his existence because she had learned long ago that no one could help her. But Callum kept watching, and slowly, piece by piece, he began to understand that Princess Verethi was not voiceless at all, and that she had been speaking her whole life in a language that no dragon had ever learned to hear. The big question was whether anyone would listen. 3 months passed, and Callum had filled 17 notebooks with his observations. He had stolen the notebooks from a supply room where the servants kept records of inventory, and he had fashioned a pen from materials he found in the recycling bins, and every night after his duties were finished, he sat in his small quarters and wrote down everything he had seen. The smoke that came from Verethi's throat was not random, and it was not meaningless, and the more he watched, the more certain he became that she was trying to speak. Dragons communicated through fire, and their flames carried frequencies that other dragons could hear and understand, and these frequencies contained their emotions and their intentions, and most importantly, their true names, and this was how they had built their civilization, and this was how they recognized each other as real and alive and worthy. But fire was not the only way to carry information. Callum had studied the history of human communication, and he knew that his ancestors had once spoken with drums and smoke signals and gestures, and they had found ways to share meaning long before written language existed, and the universe was full of ways to speak if you knew how to listen. Verethi's smoke had temperature variations that were subtle but measurable, and it had colors at its edges that flickered between gray and pale blue and violet, and it curled and twisted in patterns that repeated themselves in certain situations. When she was sad, the smoke drifted low and slow and had a cool blue tinge at its edges, and when she was frustrated, it came in short, sharp bursts with hints of orange, and when she looked at the stars with longing, it spiraled upward in delicate helixes that seemed to reach toward the ship she would never command. This was language, and Callum was certain of it. The problem was translation. He needed to understand what her smoke patterns meant in draconic terms, and for that he needed access to information that was forbidden to slaves, and he needed to see the flame charts that dragons used to teach their young, and he needed to compare Verethi's smoke to the fire speech of her kind. The Imperial Library was located in the upper spires, and no human had ever been allowed inside, but Callum learned that servants were sometimes sent there to clean the floors and polish the ancient crystal displays, and he volunteered for this duty whenever he could. The dragons who guarded the library barely looked at him because he was just a human with a mop and bucket, and he was beneath their notice, and this invisibility became his greatest advantage. While he cleaned, he memorized the library contained records of Draconid language going back thousands of years, and there were charts showing the frequency patterns of royal names, and there were studies of how flame speech developed in young dragons, and there were even ancient texts about dragons who had been born with damaged flame glands. These texts were written in the Draconid script, and Callum had taught himself to read it during his time as a slave, because language was his gift, and his obsession, and he absorbed new forms of communication the way other people absorbed music or art. What he learned changed everything. The ancient texts spoke of a condition called flame silence, and it had occurred rarely throughout Draconid history, and the dragons who suffered from it could not produce fire, but their bodies still generated the frequencies that carried their true names. The frequencies were simply trapped in healthy dragons. These frequencies were released through plasma combustion in their throats, but in dragons with flame silence, the combustion never occurred. And the frequencies had nowhere to go, and they remained locked inside, slowly building pressure over the years. The text said that these dragons often died young because the pressure eventually became too much, but some of them survived by finding other ways to release small amounts of energy, and the most common way was through heated smoke. Verethi was not voiceless, and she was screaming, and she'd been screaming her whole life in a frequency that no dragon could hear because they only listened for fire. But humans heard differently. Human ears could detect a wider range of frequencies than Draconid ears, and human instruments could measure temperature and color variations that dragons ignored and human brains were wired to find. Patterns in chaos and meaning in noise, Callum began to build a translation matrix in his mind, and he compared the Wraithy's smoke patterns to the flame charts he had memorized, and he looked for correlations between her expressions and the known emotional frequencies in Draconid language. It took him another 2 months, but eventually he found it. Hidden in the spiraling patterns of her smoke was a sequence that repeated itself over and over, and it appeared whenever she was alone and whenever she looked at her own reflection, and whenever she watched her siblings burn bright in the distance. It was her name. Her true name had been trying to escape her throat since the day she was born, and had been encoded in every breath of smoke she had ever released, and no one had ever heard it because no one had ever thought to listen. Callum practiced the sound in secret, and he used his human voice to recreate the frequency patterns he had decoded, and it was not a word in any language he knew, and it was not something human throats were designed to produce, but he worked at it night after night until he could speak it clearly. Then he waited for the right moment. It came on a night when the palace was quiet and Verethi stood alone on her balcony, as she always did, and she was watching a fleet of warships depart for some distant conquest, and the smoke from her throat curled upward in those sad, slow spirals that Callum had learned to recognize. He approached her carefully, because he was still a slave, and she was still a princess, and he knew that what he was about to do could get him killed. But some things were more important than survival. "Your Highness," he said softly, and she turned to look at him with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness, and he saw confusion on her face, because servants did not speak to royalty unless spoken to first. "I think I know your name," he said, and before she could respond, he spoke it. The sound that came from Callum's throat was unlike anything Verethi had ever heard. It was not fire, and it was not smoke, and it was something in between, and it resonated in the air like a bell that had been struck after centuries of silence. And the vibrations traveled through her scales and into her bones and down into the deepest part of her being, where something ancient and forgotten had been waiting. She felt it before she understood it. There was a pressure in her chest that she had carried her whole life, and she had grown so used to it that she no longer noticed it. And it was like a weight that pressed against her heart and lungs and throat, and it had been building since the day she hatched. When Callum spoke her name, that pressure found release. The fire erupted from her throat without warning, and it was not the orange and red of common dragons, and it was not the gold of her royal siblings, and it was blue and white and so intensely hot that the stone beneath her feet began to glow and crack. Verethi screamed, and the scream was made of flame, and the flame carried her name out into the universe for the first time in 30 cycles of existence. The balcony turned to glass beneath her claws, and the metal railings melted and dripped like water, and the air itself seemed to ignite around her as decades of trapped energy finally found its way free. She burned and burned and burned until there was nothing left inside her but emptiness and peace. When the flames finally died, she collapsed to her knees, and she was trembling, and tears that evaporated instantly streamed down her face, and she looked at her claws and saw that they were glowing with residual heat. She had fire. She had a voice. She had a name. Alarms began to sound throughout the palace, and guards came running with weapons drawn, and servants fled in terror, and in the distance she could hear her father roaring questions and his advisors demanding to know what had happened. But Verity was not looking at any of them. She was looking at Callum. The human had been thrown backward by the force of her flames, and he was lying against the wall with burns on his arms and face, and his clothes were singed and smoking, but he was alive and he was smiling. How? Verity whispered, and her voice crackled with embers and sparks, and she had never heard herself speak before, and the sound was strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Callum pushed himself up slowly and winced at the pain in his burned skin, but his eyes were bright with something that looked like joy. "You were always speaking," he said, and his voice was hoarse from the heat he had endured. "You were always saying your name, and no one was listening. And I just learned how to hear." The guards arrived then, and they saw the destroyed balcony, and they saw the human slave with burns on his body, and they drew their own conclusions, and two of them seized Callum by the arms and began to drag him away. "Wait," the Rathi commanded, and her voice carried fire now, and the guards stopped because they had never heard the silent princess speak before, and they did not know how to react. "He awakened my flame," she said, and she rose to her feet, and her scales still glowed with heat, and she looked more like a dragon than she ever had. "He spoke my name, and you will not touch him." But the guards were not the problem. The problem was the crowd that had gathered behind them, and the nobles and priests and military commanders who had come to see what caused the disturbance, and they were all staring at the Reethi with expressions that ranged from shock to fear to calculating interest. And standing at the front of the crowd was High Priest Morvax. He was ancient even by dragon standards, and his scales had faded to pale gray, and his eyes burned with cold fire, and he had served the obsidian throne for 500 cycles, and he was the keeper of sacred law and the guardian of Draconid tradition. "The princess has found her flame," he said, and his voice was soft, but it carried through the silence like poison. "This is cause for celebration." He paused and looked at Callum with an expression of disgust, but a human spoke a royal true name. He continued, "This is blasphemy of the highest order, and the sacred texts are clear, and the punishment is death." Murmurs spread through the crowd, and Verity felt her newly awakened fire surge in her chest, and she stepped forward and placed herself between Callum and the high priest. "The sacred texts also speak of the rite of awakening," she said, and she had spent 30 years in the library, reading everything she could find, and she knew the old laws better than most priests. When a being speaks a dragon's true name for the first time, they are bound to that dragon by bonds deeper than blood, and to harm them is to harm the dragon whose name they spoke. Morvax's eyes narrowed, and she could see him searching his memory for a counter-argument, but the rite of awakening was ancient, and it had been written in the earliest days of Draconid civilization when names were sacred beyond all other things. "That law was written for dragons," he said finally, "not for humans, and not for slaves." "The law does not specify," Verity replied, and she felt strength flowing through her that she had never felt before. "It says any being, and a human is a being, and this human gave me back my name and my fire and my voice, and I will burn anyone who tries to take him from me." To emphasize her point, she breathed a small stream of blue-white flame into the air, and the crowd stepped back, and even Morvax flinched, because the heat of her fire was unlike anything they had seen before. 30 years of pressure had been released all at once, and her flames were hotter than any dragon in living memory. The standoff might have continued, but then a new voice spoke from the back of the crowd, and it was deep and powerful. and it belonged to Emperor Kalvaxer himself. Enough, he said, and the crowd parted for him, and he walked forward until he stood before his daughter, and he looked at her with an expression. She could not read. "My child," he said quietly. "You have your flame." "Yes, father," she replied, and she met his gaze without flinching. "I have my flame, and I have my name, and I have this human to thank for both." The Emperor looked at Callum and then back at Varathi, and she could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, and he was weighing tradition against politics, against family, against power. Finally he nodded. "The right of awakening stands," he declared. "The human belongs to Princess Varathi, and no one will touch him without her permission." Morvax opened his mouth to protest, but the Emperor silenced him with a look, and the matter was settled, at least for now. But as the crowd dispersed, Varathi saw the looks they gave her, and she saw the fear and the suspicion and the anger, and she knew that this was not over. She had found her voice, but now she would have to learn how to use it, and the human who had given her that voice would have to survive long enough to help her. In the days that followed, the palace became a nest of whispers and schemes. The news spread across the Imperium faster than light, and every noble house and military commander and colonial governor heard the story of the silent princess who had found her flame, and they heard that a human slave had been the one to awaken it. Some celebrated because a royal dragon finding a voice was always cause for joy, and some worried because the circumstances were strange and unprecedented, and some began to plot because they saw opportunity in the chaos. But most of them were afraid. Callum understood this fear better than Varathi did, because he had spent his life studying how societies responded to things they could not explain, and fear was always the first response and violence was usually the second. He tried to warn her. "They will come for me," he said as she tended to the Burnside's arms with a healing salve that smelled of copper and smoke. "Not today and probably not tomorrow, but soon, and they will find a way to separate us." Varathi looked at him with eyes that still glowed faintly from her awakening, and she had not fully adjusted to having fire in her veins, and she was still learning to control the heat that rose. Whenever she felt strong emotions, "I protected you," she said. "My father declared the right of awakening, and no one can challenge that." "Your father declared it because it was convenient," Callum replied, and he spoke carefully because he was still a slave and she was still a princess, and the gap between them had not disappeared just because she owed him her voice. But convenience fades and fear grows, and the priests will find a way around the law. He was right. High Priest Morvax had retreated to the Temple of Eternal Flame after the confrontation, and he had spent 3 days searching the sacred archives for anything that could undo the protection that Varathi had claimed. On the 4th day he found it. The ancient texts spoke of corruption, and they warned that true names could be tainted by unworthy vessels, and they prescribed a ritual called the purification, in which the corrupting influence would be burned away and the name would be cleansed. Morvax interpreted this to mean that Callum's voice had tainted Varathi's name, and that she would need to undergo the purification to restore her sacred honor, and that the corrupting influence, meaning Callum, would need to be destroyed. He brought this interpretation to the Imperial Council, and the military commanders who had always resented the humans supported him, and the nobles who feared change supported him, and even some of the Reva's siblings supported him because they had grown comfortable being the only voices in the palace. The Emperor listened to the arguments, and he was torn because he loved his daughter in his own distant way. But he also feared the instability that her awakening had caused, and he did not want a human at the center of his court. He called Varathi to the throne room. She came with Callum beside her because she refused to leave him alone where assassins could reach him, and the court gasped at the sight of a human walking alongside a princess as if they were equals. "My daughter," the Emperor said, and his voice echoed through the vast chamber. "The High Priest has raised concerns about the manner of your awakening, and the Callisti Council believes that a purification may be necessary. Varathi felt her fire surge, and she had to force herself to remain calm. And what does the purification require? She asked, though she already knew the answer. The destruction of the corrupting influence. Morvax answered before the Emperor could speak, and his old eyes gleamed with satisfaction. The human must burn. The court murmured in agreement, and Varathi saw the faces of her brothers and sisters, and they were watching her with expressions that ranged from pity to amusement, and none of them would stand with her. She was alone, or so they thought. I invoked the challenge of names, Varathi said, and her voice rang through the chamber, and the murmurs stopped, and even the Emperor leaned forward in surprise. The challenge of names was older than the rite of awakening, and it was rarely invoked because the consequences were absolute, and it stated that any dragon could defend their name against accusations of corruption by speaking it before witnesses. If the name burned true, the accusations would be dismissed. If the name faltered, the accused would be exiled. You would risk exile? The Emperor asked, and there was something in his voice that might have been concern or might have been calculation. I would risk anything for my name, Varathi replied, and for the one who gave it to me. She stepped forward until she stood in the center of the chamber, and she could feel every eye upon her, and she could feel the weight of 10,000 years of tradition pressing down on her shoulders. Then she breathed her name in fire. It erupted from her throat in a column of blue-white plasma that reached toward the ceiling, and the heat was so intense that the nearest nobles had to step back, and the flames carried her true name in frequencies that every dragon in the room could hear and understand. And her name was pure. It rang through the chamber like a bell, and it resonated with power that none of them had expected, and there was no corruption in it, and there was no taint, and there was only the voice of a princess who had waited 30 years to speak when the flames died. Varathi stood unmarked and unburned, and she looked at Morvax with eyes that dared him to challenge her again. My name burns true, she said. By the ancient law, my accusations are dismissed, and the human remains under my protection. Morvax's face twisted with fury, but he could not argue, and the law was clear, and he had witnessed her flames himself. But he was not finished. The law protects the human from us, he said slowly, but it does not protect us from the humans. And what if this is not the only one who can hear our names? And what if they are all listening? The chamber fell silent. We conquered their world, Morvax continued, and his voice grew stronger. As he saw the fear spreading through the court, we brought thousands of them to our homeworld, and we put them in our palaces and our ships and our military installations, and we never thought to wonder if they might be learning. He pointed at Callum with one gray claw. This human decoded a royal true name in less than a year, and he had no special training and no special equipment, and only his ears and his mind. And if one human can do this, then all of them can, and every human in the Imperium is a threat. The fear was visible now, and it spread through the court like wildfire, and Varathi saw it on the faces of generals and nobles, and even her own father, and she realized that Callum had been right. They were not afraid of her. They were afraid of all of humanity, and that fear would be far more dangerous than any ancient law. The Draconian Imperium responded to its fear the way empires always respond to fear, and they chose violence. Emperor Kolvaxer ordered the immediate execution of every human slave on the homeworld, and the military commanders began planning the complete extermination of Earth, and the colonial governors received instructions to round up all humans in their territories and burn them before they could become a threat. Varathi learned of these orders through servants who still whispered secrets in the lower spires, and she knew she had to act quickly, or billions of innocent people would die. We have to warn them, she told Callum in the dead of night, when they were alone in her chambers. We have to find a way to reach Earth before the fleet does. Callum looked at her with an expression she had learned to recognize as thoughtful and calculating, and he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. There is another way, he said, a way that does not require us to outrun warships or fight armies. He told her about the human resistance even after the conquest. The humans had not stopped fighting, and they had simply changed their tactics, and they had created hidden networks that stretched across the occupied worlds, and they had been watching and learning and preparing for the day when they could strike back, and they had been listening to dragon flames. Callum was not the only human who had realized that Draconid fire speech could be decoded, and there were linguists and scientists and engineers in bunkers on a dozen worlds who had been analyzing flame frequencies for decades, and they had cracked the code long before Callum ever arrived at the palace. They knew the true names of hundreds of dragons. Verity felt her fire surge with a mixture of hope and fear. "What good does knowing names do?" she asked. "Knowing my name did not give you power over me, and it did not let you control my fire." "No," Callum agreed, "but it let me speak to you, and it let me reach the part of you that no one else could reach, and names have power, Verity, and not the power to control, but the power to connect." He explained what he meant. Dragons could not harm those who spoke their true names, and this was not a law, but a biological reality, and it was hardwired into their brains from millions of years of evolution. And when a dragon heard their name spoken with recognition and understanding, their fire simply would not ignite against the speaker. The ancient dragons had developed this trait to prevent them from destroying each other in territorial disputes, and it forced them to recognize each other as real and worthy, and it was the foundation of their entire civilization, and humans could trigger that same response. If humans broadcast Draconid true names across every frequency and every channel, then every dragon who heard their name would be unable to fire, and their weapons would not ignite, and their ships would not burn, and the entire military machine of the Imperium would grind to a halt. "We do not have to fight them," Callum said. "We just have to speak to them." Verity understood, and she made her choice. She used her royal access codes to open a secure channel to the human resistance, and she spoke to leaders who had been fighting in the shadows for 50 years, and she told them that she was the princess who had been awakened by a human, and she told them that she wanted to help. They did not trust her at first, because why would a dragon betray her own kind for slaves and creatures she had been taught were beneath her? But Callum spoke for her, and his voice carried weight among the resistance, because word of what he had done had spread, and he was already becoming a legend. And when he vouched for Verity, they agreed to listen together. They created a plan. The Draconid fleet would arrive at Earth in 30 days, and the humans had that long to prepare their broadcast, and they needed to gather every true name they had decoded, and they needed to build transmission arrays powerful enough to reach every ship in the fleet. It seemed impossible, but humans had always been good at achieving the impossible. Verity provided intelligence from inside the palace, and she learned which admirals commanded which ships, and she discovered the patrol routes and communication frequencies, and she passed everything to the resistance through channels that not even her father's spies could detect. And when the day came, she stood on her balcony and watched the fleet depart, and she knew that history was about to change. The Battle of Earth lasted exactly 7 minutes. The Draconid fleet emerged from hyperspace with weapons charged and flames ready, and they expected to find a defenseless world waiting to be burned, and instead they found something they had never encountered in 10,000 years of conquest. They found voices. The humans broadcast the true names of every dragon in the fleet, and the transmission came from thousands of sources simultaneously, and it echoed through every frequency and every channel, and it spoke with clarity and recognition and understanding. The dragons heard their names spoken by human voices, and their fire would not come. Admiral Corotheus tried to give the order to attack, and the words caught in his throat, and his flame guttered and died, and he stared at his command console in confusion and horror. Across the fleet, the same thing was happening, and thousands of dragons found themselves unable to burn, and their weapons would not ignite, and their engines would not fire, and they drifted in the void while human voices continued to speak their names. It was not an attack, and it was not a cod weapon, and it was something far more profound. It was recognition. The humans were saying, "We hear you, and we know you, and we see you as real." And the dragons could not respond with violence, because their own biology would not allow them to harm those who spoke their names. The fleet returned home in silence, and the admirals could not explain what had happened, and the emperor could not understand how his mighty armada had been defeated without a single shot being fired. But Verithy understood. She stood before the Imperial Council one final time, and Callum stood beside her, and the court looked at them with fear and confusion, and she knew that the old ways were ending. "For 10,000 years we ruled through fire," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the chamber. "We burned our way across the galaxy, and we never stopped to listen. And we never thought that anyone might be listening to us." She looked at her father, and she saw an old dragon who had never learned to hear anything but his own roar. "The humans heard us," she continued. "They heard our names, and they spoke them back to us, and now we have a choice, and we can keep trying to burn them, or we can learn to speak with them." The emperor was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was tired and old. "What would you have us do?" he asked. "Make peace," Verithy replied. "Recognize humanity as equals, and free the slaves, and negotiate as partners instead of masters." It took time, and there was resistance, and there were those who would rather die than accept humans as equals. But the fire that had built the Imperium could no longer burn against those who knew their names. The treaties were signed, and the slaves were freed, and Earth took its place among the spacefaring civilizations of the galaxy. And Princess Verithy became the first Draconid ambassador to humanity, with Callum at her side, not as a slave, but as her partner and her voice and her equal. At the ceremony that marked a new era, she was asked to speak, and she looked out at the crowd of humans and dragons who had come together in peace, and she remembered the silent girl who had stood alone on her balcony watching ships. She thought she would never command. "I was born without a voice," she said, "and I had spent 30 years believing that I had nothing to say, and that a human taught me that. I had been speaking all along, and I just needed someone to listen." She looked at Callum, and he smiled, and she felt her fire warm in her chest with something that was not rage or fear, but gratitude and love. "That is the lesson we must all learn," she said. "Fire is not the only way to speak, and the most powerful thing in the universe is not the ability to burn, but the ability to be heard." The crowd was silent, and then they began to cheer, and the sound was made of human voices and dragon flames, and it rose into the sky like a promise. The voiceless princess had found her voice, and she had taught the galaxy to listen.